My name is Helena Kennedy, and I'm going to chair this session. I'm a lawyer, and I have written and acted in many cases involving women's rights over, I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but next year I will have practiced at the bar for 50 years. Anyway, there you are. Don't tell anybody. Anyway, I'm getting very aged, and one of the great frustrations of my life is that when I was the age of most of you, I somehow imagined that by the time I got to the age that I now am, that we would have somehow got to a better place than we've got to on the issue of women's rights, on the ways in which the criminal justice system, in which I've worked for all of my professional life. I thought that we would have made more gains than we have, and it is a scandal that we haven't. So we have a marvelous group of people here on the stage. They are the most amazing, skilled and knowledgeable folks. And I'm just going to say to all of you, first of all, that there's a number of sort of ground rules that we have to run by, which is that time is of the essence, and so there's a turnaround business at the end. So I'm going to have to hold people to quite tight timing. But forgive me for that, but it's just the way of things. The other thing is that we are talking about issues that are very emotionally sensitive and hard. And so if any of you are feeling that you have your own story to tell, it may be that this room is not the best place to do that. And there is the wonderful fact that we have great people who are skilled therapists here today who are present downstairs, apparently in the Great Hall at the marketplace there. And they are from the Survivors Trust. And if any of you want to talk about experiences you've had, they would be very willing to be available to you. And apparently, on our program list somewhere at the back, I haven't examined it all as carefully as that, but there are lists of organizations that are helpful in addressing some of these issues. Now, I just wanted to start by saying that the issue of shame, I wrote many years ago, before many of you were even born, I wrote a book called Eve Was Framed. Framed because of the whole way in which women end up getting blamed for the conduct of men. And that was one of the lessons that I learned very early as a young practitioner at the bar. At the time where I had joined the women's movement in the early 70s, I started practicing almost at the same sort of time and started looking at the law through a particular lens, which was the lens of being a woman, a feminist who wanted, justice for women. And what became very clear to me was the way in which women were being judged, that when women were at the receiving end of transgressions of all kinds, that somehow or other women were measured by different standards. And part of that business is, and I recently, over the decades, have brought up to date Eve Was Framed, the book. And when I came to do it in 2017, my publishers were pushing me and saying, there's so much going on and very little gains, what are we going to do? And I said, well, we'll bring it up to date. And I couldn't bring it up to date because so much was happening, and I was filled with rage, and I called the newest version of it Eve Was Shamed, not Eve Was Framed. I changed the name, and because lots of you all thought, well, I've read that book, I've read it 20 years ago, we discovered that it was better to actually give it a completely different title, and in paperback it's called Misjustice. And what I was trying to deal with in the business of changing that name and introducing the word shame was that shame is the burden that women carry in relation to all of this. And it starts because of the way in which shame is used as a way of controlling women. And be very clear of that. It's about making us feel that our sexuality is something to be ashamed of, and that if we are women who in any way are deemed to be inappropriate or where our conduct does not measure up to some bizarre standard, then we are measured as failing. And that's what so much of the criminal justice system is measured around. And I have to say to all of you that it is not just in the United Kingdom, it's around the world. I can't think of any place where it's any different. And I remember going as an independent assessor to look at projects that were set up after the abysmal business of the invasion of Iraq. And I went to a prison because this was about the generality of human rights. It's one of the things that I now do in my international work. And so I was sent to measure up to see whether these programs of change were really working. And I went to a prison, and it was purely by accident, by asking a question. I was saying, are there women's prisons? And somebody said, oh, there's women in this prison. Oh, really? Could I meet with the women who are in this prison? And they all got very shirty and shifty. And I insisted that I wanted to meet with the women. And of course, there was no exercise yard. The women were in a sort of dark hovel. And when I questioned what they were there for, I discovered that virtually every single one was there for a morality offence, that there are crimes of a moral nature, and it was of a nonsense, that if they were seen in a way talking to a man without a guardian there, holding hands with somebody, all manner of low-level offending. These women were in prison for it, and often because of the dishonour families meant, they would have no family to go back to. And I remember one of them in this prison shed, there was a little girl who was about 3, and she was the blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and she was the child, in fact, of a relationship that this young woman had with a GI. Who in the years before, and all these women were caring for this child, and I said, a prison's not the place for a child. And I remember them saying, the family will not have this child, and nobody else will have this child, and the chances are that if we make a complaint about the presence of this child in this prison, she'll end up being trafficked. And so I had to sort of turn the page and walk out of that prison, reporting on the conditions of women and so on, but making no reference to the fact that there was a child there, because the alternatives for that child were so dire that, in fact, being there was probably better for her. The world is filled with these kinds of judgments of women. And so we're very lucky to have the group that we have today and to take this conversation into the courts here in Britain. And so let me introduce to you, and I'm going to ask my wonderful panel to wave when I refer to them. Alex Fanghanel, where are Alex? Yes, wave. Alex is a real expert in the whole business of sexuality and consent and BDSM, and she's an associate professor of criminology. And we were remembered that we had met on a number of these kinds of occasions before. I have to tell you that that's what happens when you delve into this work. There are some of us who have been doing it for so many years. I have also with me Mandu Reid, probably well known to many of you, who is the leader of the Equality Party, who stood for election, who has really put onto the agenda so many of the issues affecting women. And one of its purposes is to hold the other parties to account and to really rattle the bars of our political cages. Mandu is a force to be reckoned with, and it's great to have you here again, Mandy, to see you. Professor Amina Memon is here with us, and she is the director. Amina, can you give a wee wave? Yeah. Director of the Centre for the Study of Emotion and Law at Royal Holloway. And the real problem is that the law is pretty incompetent and incapable of dealing with real emotion. And my next person, I'm going to introduce you to Charlotte Proudman, a barrister, an expert in gender-based violence. She's written a great book, which you haven't all seen yet, but I have, which is FGM, on FGM, and it's really looking at that whole business and its impact on women's lives and women's sexuality. And I got a pre-read ahead of other people, and it is a really great book. And now Tashmia Owen, who's a visual arts expert, a writer, a campaigner, a script writer. She explores the whole lives experiences of women of colour. And into this discussion, that we have to recognise that intersectionality is at its heart. That you know, the things that are experienced by the women who are in the, if you like, in the dominant class in a society, experience it differently from people who are people from ethnic minorities, people who have disabilities, people who are gay, people who have people of difference at all. And those things, multiple discriminations, make for even more treachery within the criminal justice system. And so it's very important for us to be very aware and alert and conscious of those differences. So I want to kick off by actually asking my wonderful panel if they might just very quickly, and I'm going to be very ruthless, I'm going to be like Stalin's granny in my fierce way of controlling this. So can I ask Alex, first of all, if you might just give us a little kick-off about your contribution to this discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here as well to join us in this really important discussion. One of the things which propelled me to want to come to this discussion is the is a tension that I've seen in my research and my work around the relationship between sexual pleasure, desire, risk-taking, and how that is encountered by a criminal justice system, which I think, hopefully we'll be able to unpack this a bit more as we go through our discussion, adopts almost a false sex-positive perspective on some cases where women come, or not necessarily women, because in the cases which I've been looking at most recently, the women in question are dead. Cases in which women have been killed as parts of apparently consensual sex games gone wrong. The way in which those cases are argued about and then discussed and judged, the language and the way in which the acts in those instances are figured are mobilize a sense of false sex positivity, where a sense that women's rights and agency to sexual expression should be recognized, which is absolutely the case, but that it's strategically mobilized in order to paint a picture of sexual violence, which is able to hide under a guise of consent. And so what I've been looking at, and what I think is really important, one of the things we should talk about is the ways in which we think about the criminal justice system as party to the contemporary rape culture in which this sort of thing is able to happen, or maybe even a crucible through which those things are enacted. And so my work is much more about rape culture more broadly. I don't think the law can save us, so that's something which I can put my stall out there right at the beginning. But what I think is really important is that it is it's such a significant part of the way in which we live our lives and the structure and problems that we come across. So we have to engage with it. It has to do something, but will it save us? I'm not sure.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for sticking so much to time. But I mean, Alex is really raising something very important, and it's something that's been going on in the courts for too long, which is this business of saying she wanted rough sex. It's the rough sex defense, you know, and it happens in rape when there is clear physical evidence of violence, where it's all claimed that even that is with consent, and also in the cases where women end up dead, where the claim is she wanted me to strangle her. And so some of the changes in the law recently around that business of strangulation is now being addressed, and I'm going to get Alex to just deal with that. What do you think that the recent change in the law in the Domestic Abuse Act, introducing a particular offence which is about really strangulation in sex? I mean. Yeah, I mean, so.
One of the issues I see with that is that the enshrining in the Domestic Abuse Act the fact that it is illegal to participate to consent to these things, that was already always the law straight from the Brown case. Of the dates escape me, but we're going to go with the 94, something like that.
Yeah.
And so it's always been the case that I mean, problematically or not, and that's also a debate which I have outside of this context, for people who practice consensual BDSM, it's always been something which was not that people couldn't consent to. So the addition of this clarifies perhaps the position which was already in place. But given that, notwithstanding the fact that it has always been illegal to strangle someone, even if they've asked to be strangled, even though that has always been the case, it hasn't stopped the rate, and including the increased rate of women being seriously injured or killed in circumstances where that is claimed to have happened. So it's not clear to me that would necessarily bring about the change that it's expected to, because it's layered upon a context where these sorts of sexual practices have become, or a version of them has problematically become normalized. And so, I'm less optimistic about that.
Okay. I just wanted to say, always start from the assumption of no knowledge. BDSM?
Sorry.
Tell people what it is.
So sorry. The BDSM stands for bondage, domination, and sadomasochism, and so it describes eroticized power play in a sexual context. And one of the key tenets of it is that it's a consensual act. There are other key tenets of it, but at its heart, consent is central to these sorts of sexual practices, and what distinguishes it from sexual violence is consent. And so people can participate in BDSM consensually, very pleasurably. For practitioners of BDSM, it's an inherent part of their sexuality. So their sexual citizenship rights to practice it are necessarily menaced by a legal system which criminalizes many aspects of BDSM. But but at the same time, with the other hand, what we see is like a generalized acceptance that BDSM happens and that people should be allowed to consent to things. And so therefore, because this may have happened, actually, we're going to downgrade murder to manslaughter, or finally find something to have been an accident. So it has significant material effects on justice outcomes.
And for any of you who are not lawyers in here, and that's probably the majority of you, there was a very famous case in the 90s which involved homosexual sadomasochistic sex, in which people seemed to enjoy nailing each other's penises to the floor, and said it was consensual. And eventually our highest court, which was the House of Lords Committee, appellate committee, decided that certain things, even if consensual, would be against the public interest. And there was a lot of controversy over the decision, but they said that there were certain things within the context of, particularly of sexual activity, where sort of consent was actually no defense, because they were sort of against the interests of the humanity of the individual, the human dignity of the individual. Anyway, Charlotte, I'm going to take over to you, because you're a practitioner of the law and in the courts regularly just now, and perhaps you might like to talk about the shaming aspect of this, of how women going to the legal system, to the police, to the prosecutorial system with an allegation of rape, how that's dealt with, and why it is that we are facing this absolutely abysmal business where it's almost as if rape has been decriminalized.
Yeah, so I wanted to start actually by saying and asking you a question. Has rape become decriminalized? We know that 85,000 women and girls are raped every year in England and Wales alone. And in the year of 2020, just over 1,000 rapes resulted in a conviction, which is absolutely astounding given those soaring levels of rape. And why is that? Why is it that 60 men in the UK have killed women during so-called rough sex, and not one woman has killed a man during rough sex? These are gender-based crimes. They are violence against women and girls, and yet our system, in my view, is ingrained with institutional misogyny right from the outset. When a woman bravely and courageously goes to the police to report rape or sexual assault, and then they're met often with a disbelief, and they feel that their history is put on trial, who they've slept with, whether they enjoy rough sex, whether they've had consensual sex with the same perpetrator who they're now accusing of rape. They are put on trial. And how many women want to go through this? Many say to me that they feel that they're being re-victimized and they feel it's re-traumatizing. And I wanted to share with you one example of a case which I looked at. I looked at the police disclosure of this case. I've removed any details so you wouldn't know who they are. But this, in my view, is a fairly classic example of how the police deal with such cases. So in the police report, they put evidential difficulties. 1, no CCTV. Not surprising when you consider that the alleged rape was in a partnership over a number of years with repeated rapes. Number 2, the complainant substantially lacks any detail of alleged multiple incidents. No recognition of the amount of trauma that she might have experienced over an enduring relationship of rape, domestic abuse, and coercive and controlling behaviour. Number 3, no independent witnesses. Well, how many people would you imagine are in a bedroom or wherever in the flat observing the fact that they're being raped? I mean, it's beggars belief. And then, of course, you have the fact that, no one's walking around wearing body cam footage, but they somehow expect that they are. Number 4, late reporting, so there are no forensics. I mean, good grief, you just sort of give up after a while, don't you? Conversations between the parties, because of course they've trawled through their social media, Facebook messages, text messages, you name it, supplied, which suggests that the complainant wants to remain in a relationship with the perpetrator. We all know how difficult it is, if not impossible, for women to escape abusive relationships. This is not uncommon and can be, for example, Stockholm syndrome, amongst other forms of traumatization. Character of the complainant is called into question, as messages are received between a friend which suggest a tendency to potentially exaggerate what on earth these messages are, not even in the context of rape, just general messages and chit-chat between a friend. And then it goes on, this is the final one, that the suspect during the interview stated that all sexual activity was consensual. This is a word against word investigation. It's a he said, she said. What a surprise. This is most rape investigations. We know how this works. The police lack not only the resources, but the skill, the training, the understanding to be able to properly investigate rape complaints. And then, as Helena and others know, when it finally does arrive at court, well, then that's a whole different ballgame. And we see these tropes, stereotypes played out. She was asking for it. She was wearing a short skirt. She enjoyed sex on these occasions. Therefore, it's implied that she consented on other occasions. Cross-examination can go on for over a day, sometimes even longer. It's a horrendous process to go through. And one may even question whether sometimes the trials, which I've seen, it's like watching sometimes a wounded animal being continually beaten over and over again in a courtroom context. And someone spoke on the earlier panel about survivor porn. What we often see is rape victims porn, in the way in which a rape trial is presented in the court. It becomes almost pornographic, and every single intimate detail and personal nature of that rape is laid bare for the public to see. So thinking about the whole courtroom process, does that amount to an Article 3 breach? Is it torture? Is it inhumane treatment? And is our public system, the courts, continuing and repeating that trauma?
Charlotte, it beggars belief, some of that, because it was going on when I was young, and it's going on. Here we are, nearly 50 years later. It's just perennial. Mandu.
First of all, I want to start by saying I think it's really important that we're having this conversation. What you've outlined, Charlotte, 85,000 cases in England and Wales. I think when you add in Northern Ireland and Scotland, we're talking about 100,000. I think that's a conservative estimate. That's 11 women raped every hour. So this panel's going to last for just over an hour. You do the maths. It's important we're having this conversation, though, because that status quo, that 100,000, is not, as was discussed on the previous panel, an inevitability. It doesn't need to be an inevitability, and we can't allow it to be an inevitability. But shame, stigma, and silence around these issues, those three things are foot soldiers of that status quo. And it is our job, it is our job, it is our duty, it is our calling to challenge and tackle that. We've spoken already briefly about institutional dysfunction, if we're talking about the legal system. We've talked about women being failed. We've talked about the police, because the criminal justice system is a long tunnel in a way. You've got the front end with the police, and it goes all the way up to the judiciary and the statute, what's actually written in law. There's a lot of work to do, but we have to remember that we can make changes to the law, and I believe in pursuing that. I do agree, Alex, that the law won't save us. The reason why it won't save us, though, is because the institutions that we're talking about are microcosms of our society. The biases, the misogyny, all that stuff that kind of creates the dysfunction stems from what's going on in society. And for this reason, the fact that this issue is so widespread, the fact that we're talking about institutional dysfunction, stereotypes, cultural, attitudinal, behavioral issues, tell me that this is political. Action is needed across so many different spheres that the only way you can really mobilize that action is via getting a formidable and meaningful response from the political process. And that's why I always say this will be, for as long as it needs to be, a central plank of what the Women's Equality Party does. When we're talking about those numbers, though, I want to go a tiny bit granular because it's really important. That stuff can get forgotten. Disabled women, twice as likely to be victims of sexual assault as compared to non-disabled women. Black women, twice as likely to be victims of rape as compared to white women. Mixed race women, 4 times as likely as compared to white women to be victims of rape. It's really important we look at that granular stuff. A friend of mine from Brazil said in the part of the country she comes from, they have this saying that's very well known. And it goes something like this. It's pretty horrendous, but this is how it goes. White women are for marriage. Mixed race women are for fucking. And black women are for work. And this is why, what that illustrates to me is how we can talk about the legal system, but we cannot decouple that from what's going on in society more broadly and the change we need, which must be driven by political action in order to precipitate a world where none of us, none of the girls who are coming after us have to put up with this, have to inherit it. So demand of your politicians, any political party you support mine, for goodness sake, because we're definitely always going to have this front and center for as long as we need to. That is a way for us to drive change across all the different levels. And the shame that has constrained us for so long is something that the system itself relies on. The status quo relies on our shame. So I'll leave it there for now, but I'm sure we can explore some of those themes further.
And that is really at the heart of this, is the idea that the shame is really something that is so deeply ingrained. So that when women experience abuse or the receiving end of things that are about male entitlement, and it's often, I'm afraid, expressed in that way, it's women who carry the burden of feeling shame, that they somehow brought it on their own heads. And from a very early age, children, if we're teaching our 9 and 10-year-olds self-safeguarding, which is what ends up happening. You know, beware at night. Don't come home late from school. Come back with your friend. Don't go off on your own to that bit of the park. Don't take shortcuts. Don't talk to strangers. All of that messaging is saying, but if you do and something happens to you, then of course it's your own fault because you didn't do it by the rules. And so girls are receiving this messaging from a very, very early age, and we end up being sort of, experts in risk assessing, because it's what we're taught from such a young age. And so I just feel that business of feeling that there is somehow a guilt to be associated with being the person who's at the receiving end of transgression is something that we really have to confront. And Amina Memon is here to talk about her work, which is around this kind of offending.
Yeah, so I study memory and decision making, and I've been working on police interviewing techniques for over 30 years now. And one of the issues that Charlotte raised, and I did put it in context, in the political context, is for many years now, based on evidence and research, we do know how to gather information and evidence appropriately from victims and witnesses. We know how to do that without introducing bias. Those techniques are out there. I developed the best practice guidance in Scotland, which was based on the English guidance that's been out there since 1992. Many of us have been working in an interdisciplinary context, doing training police and social work. But what we don't have is a culture. What we haven't got rid of is a culture of disbelief when it comes to victims of rape in particular. So we're seeing constantly their credibility being challenged. So we've heard a number of statistics today. We know 1 to 3% of convictions only. Why is that? 57% of victims withdraw their cases when they enter that tunnel. As many as that. Why is that? Obviously, it's re-traumatizing. Charlotte's already talked about it. We call it secondary victimization. And that's not just the individual that's being victimized. It's their friends, their family, the whole institution, perhaps, that they work in. So we know that's a barrier. But also, what are the other reasons? Not feeling believed, being judged because you're showing emotion or you're not showing emotion, being judged because you're not providing that detailed report. Well, detail isn't an indicator of whether your memory is reliable or not. It's just an indicator of credibility. And why should somebody's belief about whether you're responsible for the crime or somebody's myth that you must have done something or you gave consent, why should that make a police officer and then the CPS decide this isn't a case worth pursuing? We know there's a lot of political concerns about the fact that the CPS are only filtering through those cases that they believe can result in a conviction. We do have a system, we have an adversarial system where you have to hear from both sides. But when it comes to questioning, what I'm seeing is that there are very good techniques for having witness-centered, victim-centered interviews where you put the needs of the victim first. It's only recently that we've updated the guidance for the provision of therapeutic support. There was always a concern that if a victim's undergoing therapy, it might contaminate the evidence that that person provides, which has been a real barrier. And only in the last couple of years have they thought about, and even then there's a concern that therapist records may be disclosed, but at the same time we need to look at how, and of course there's a whole issue of intersectionality which has been touched on many, many times. We're only just beginning to understand how multiple characters, race, poverty, gender, class, social class, affect, and this is an area that we just don't understand. And when it comes to rape myths, and myths do inform people's judgments, unconscious bias does influence, and there's been one comprehensive study looking at how jurors perceive evidence in these trials, and it actually concluded there were no rape myths. But when you look at the detail of the work, it's obvious that people were responding in a socially desirable manner in those sorts of studies. So we know that there are these inherent biases, and so it's not just a case of knowing and being able to give the evidence, it's how that evidence is interpreted. And it's been a real challenge as a psychologist trying to work with lawyers and within the legal system, and especially when we developed our training in the 90s, we just couldn't get it to the CPS. I've knocked on so many doors. I mean, I was a lecturer at the time, and it's not made any difference being a professor now. I mean, partly, yes, possibly being female and black hasn't helped me, and I have to say that, but it's not through not trying. There's just so much more that needs to be done. And in a way, I want to be optimistic, but it's frustrating for someone like myself who went into this area really believing, as a PhD student, that I could make a difference. And yet here we are, still talking about 30 years later, the same rates of prosecution, and we know we've got more victims coming forward. And we know the training is there. And we've also developed training to address vulnerability, disability. We've got all that. I mean, we've got a fantastic vulnerable witness training program that's out there. Intersectionality, not so much, but we do have these resources. So what's gone wrong?
Well, one of the things that undoubtedly has not been helpful has been the arrival of social media. I mean, let's be very clear, while social media has been, on the one hand, certainly after the Me Too, when the whole business of Harvey Weinstein hit the fan, and the Me Too movement got, really it was like wildfire across the world. It was a kind of wonderful thing that there was this communication that women were not going to be silenced anymore, and so on. And I felt that was then, social media had a purpose and a sense, and also. What was interesting for me was that the idea that women were somehow had another way. It was quite frightening to the if you like, the institutions, because women were throwing a brick through the windows of the criminal justice systems around the world. They were saying, your systems, you tell us that we're supposed to bring our wrongs to the courts, and when we try to do that, we just get shafted. So why should we do it? We're just going to call folk out on social media and name and shame them for the things that they do to us. And so, and of course, then everybody got very alarmed. So at that point, it seemed as though social media had a real sort of benefit to us as women. And certainly, and I would say this for anybody who's been victimized, and that can be men too. Certainly boys can be predated on in similar ways. But the interesting thing now is that for me, the business of social media has been a megaphone for the ugliest forms of misogyny, and has actually given permission for that to actually then be translated into conduct in other arenas, in the street and in the bedroom and wherever. And women are, therefore, it is worse. It is worse. And it's worse because I think a megaphone has been given to abusers, and not just a megaphone, but a kind of way in which they see and watch this, pornography that pops up all the time on their phones from the earliest of ages, and it degrades and presents women in ways that are absolutely then translated into the conduct that women are exposed to. So I do feel that social media has been an absolutely hideous invention, and I wish it had never come along. And I say this. I mean, I say this because let's go back to its beginnings. Let's remember that Zuckerberg wanted it. What was Facebook about? It was about pulling women. It was about rating women. Do we think that they look good or not good, and who do you want to fuck and who do you not want to? It was a horrible, the origins of it tell you everything, and it has fulfilled a horrible promise in terms of objectification of women and so on. So, I mean, for me, I wish it had never happened, and there's a place in hell for Zuckerberg. Anyway, so over now to Tashmia, because you're in the creative world, you find ways of bringing this home to us all. Talk to us.
Yeah, okay. I definitely agree. I think this is political. Mm. I personally feel like the systems in place are doing exactly what they were designed to do. Mm-hmm. Today, on this panel, I'm here to speak as a survivor, coming freshly out of, just 3 weeks ago, a criminal investigation myself for rape. And for what I experienced at the hands of the police and the CPS and my assailants, there were two, and how they employed the state apparatus against me, the police, my children's school, social services, how I was re-victimized repeatedly for the whole year as an intimidation campaign, I suppose, to drop the case because I had reported it. Today I'm coming from that aspect.
We're with you. Everyone in this audience is with you. I'm sorry you've been through all of that. It's terrible. But talk to us about it. Yeah. I mean, if you feel comfortable doing so. But you've been through that, and the full horror of your experience is about the failure of a system to provide justice for women.
Yes.
And it is about the fact that you were being sort of, if you like, brushed away, but yes. Also in the course of that being treated as lesser.
Yes. From the moment I reported it, one of the assailants was well known to me, was a friend, or I believed to be a friend. That seemed to have a huge impact or bearing on how the police heard what I was saying, and around the whole aspect of consent and whether I had genuinely consented to this and changed my mind, and so had played a part in this in somehow. Even though if I had changed my mind, I should be able to change my mind. That should be absolutely, yeah. One of my assailants is a public figure and well known, and that also played a part in how the police perceived it. They seemed to think that I was doing it for attention and would somehow receive some, I'm not even sure what, because as a rape, you don't receive an award, nothing, you don't become Monica Lewinsky, you don't get a big, Vogue spread or something.
I'm not sure
These
Monica
aren't.
Lewinsky would want to visit her experience
No.
than anybody else either.
No, exactly. So I'm not sure what they feel happens, because I can't see any cases where this has happened. So I was met by disbelief from the get-go, to the point that I felt like they were investigating me, and the police were very much talking to one of my assailants as if they were apologizing for my behavior and for the trouble I was causing this assailant, and how they knew they had important work to do, and this nobody had come out of nowhere and tried to create something. One of my assailants immediately took to social media to speak about me. Over a period of a year, I lost work, I lost friends. The police, their exact words were, when this person speaks on social media, it's as though they're speaking in their living room to their friends. It is none of your business what they say about you, and it doesn't impact you. I'm not sure how somebody who has thousands and thousands of followers is speaking in their living room. What size living room is this that they're speaking in? It just doesn't, to me, make any sense. I also had, in terms of the injuries I went to the police forensic unit afterwards, had quite a lot of tests done. They had to check that my spinal cord was okay because of the amount of strangulation that had occurred. A police officer told me, or the detective, that he felt that I had consented to it, and lots of people like being strangled. Despite me saying that I hadn't, they still insisted I had forgotten that I had consented. So yeah, every aspect, the social services looked into my children, how I look after my children, if my children were safe, was I a good mother? At the school, they started questioning whether I was a safe mother because of what my assailants were doing, as well as the police response, because they suddenly started treating me as if I was mentally unstable and I had imagined the situation. It was a night out with friends, just in between two lockdowns. That also was held against me by the police, because they said, why would you be out during COVID, despite the fact that it was a ticketed event, it was a legal event, we were all tested. I had been shielding because I was just coming out of cancer treatment, and that as well was questioned, whether my cancer had been real.
It's the most horrifying and terrible story. And thank you for sharing it with us. That's really, we know how hard it must be to do that. But what it shows is the deep misogyny that exists within our policing forces.
Yes.
Within the systems itself that are supposed to be investigatory. And it's part of the problem here is about how you address that stuff when it's so deeply embedded.
Yeah.
I'm going to now, because time is of the essence, and I keep getting little signals. And so I want this to be an opportunity for all of you to interact. Can you ask questions so that I'll try and get answers? And as I mentioned at the beginning, you know, we've had a really horrible story being told about the failure of investigation, and I'm sure that there must be in this audience many people who could tell stories that are also about failures of investigation. Can we kind of try and stick it to questions rather than recounting an experience? Thank you. But please.
I'm really glad to get this chance because I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse and rape. I entered the mental health system in my 40s because it finally all came, together. I was given a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, and I was horrified at the time because, to discover the misogyny of psychiatric diagnosis, the psychiatric system, and I know too much about it now. And I've survived and recovered, and what I'm really concerned about is the stories I hear again and again, is how much this labelling and shaming and the diagnostic framework is increasing in young people, in the trans community, in the gay community, and I know some shocking stories of people who've had support of the police until their psychiatric history has been revealed and their case has been dropped. And that's my area of concern and activism. But I wanted to ask, I can see you know about it. It all joins up because it's such a big part of how the CPS operates.
I mean, one of the things that I've, over the years, written, because I've been writing about this stuff even before I published Eve Was Framed, which was in 1992, but through the 80s, writing about this stuff, which was that we started off saying, the courts would bring up people's sexual history and be cross-examining people about sexual history, but actually one of the things that, once that was sort of identified as being part of the problem, what was not dealt with in all that was the pathologizing of women by actually looking through their history to see if you at any stage had anything that indicated that you might have gone to a therapist, gone to counselling, for help about anything in your life. And so, we knew that women ended up being, asked with the defence asking to see medical records and all kinds of things. And you could have been a student who, got depressed over your exams, and suddenly your mental history was being looked at, and you were being cross-examined as to whether, it made you somebody who was a bit fragile and perhaps not always fully in touch with what was going on, and all sorts of stuff with sort of pseudo-psychology entering the courtroom. And that's been one of the shocking things as a way of undermining the credibility of women and using that sort of material. But what you're describing is a pathologizing of women who have been at the receiving end of serious abuse, and instead of approaching it from the point of view of what the offender has done, looking at examining you and examining the complainant, and it's just, you would agree with that, Charlotte?
Yeah, I just wanted to share with you, I had 2 cases recently where the women were diagnosed with histrionic personality disorders. You can see nods, which means in a person with histrionic personality disorder, the self-esteem depends on the approval of others. People with this disorder have an overwhelming desire to be noticed, behave dramatically or inappropriately to get attention. I've never seen a man diagnosed with histrionic personality disorder. It's the most sexist and misogynist term that can be used.
The business of the womb,
The womb, yeah. We know from the 1800s when we used to have clitoridectomies to cure lesbianism, hysteria.
Wrong with a woman, as far as they were concerned.
And now it's been trotted out in the courts.
Yeah. I'm going to thank you for that, because you've raised a really important element in all of this, which is that way of attacking and undermining women. There's a gentleman over there. Yes, would you like to come in?
I wonder where things are better. You mentioned things
not very good anywhere. Yeah.
Yes. There are countries or places or systems we've got to where we can say that it's
Finnish system is quite good. So in Finland, they actually have the clinical psychologists that are working with the victims in child abuse investigations and looking at the evidence and working very much with the courts and legal systems. It's very different, and it's them that provide the testimony, not the police on the evidence, which I think is a really good system.
Yeah, and I just, I look to examples of countries, and there's only a handful of them around the world where, and it's all pretty recent, where they've made a modification to their law, so you have now affirmative consent laws in place. Most recently, New South Wales in Australia have implemented those. Spain is a country where, following the absolutely horrendous rape of a woman in Pamplona, where they run the bulls, there was the wolf pack, these five or six men raped this woman, and there was a massive outpouring. This depresses me that it often takes a case of that horror and that magnitude to precipitate the change towards that kind of adjustment to the statute. But in our country, we do have consent-based laws, but in law, and you guys can help me if I get some of this if I garble it a little, here in the UK, the way it works is that the person who's been accused, if they have reasonable belief that she consented, then that kind of works in their favor. Now, I think this concept of reasonable belief is deeply problematic in a society where men feel entitled to women's bodies and entitled to sex, and misogyny is just so pervasive. So if you made an adjustment to that, you could change the line of inquiry from, did she say no, this is just keeping things super simple, to, did she say yes? And what steps did you take to ascertain whether she really wanted to be strangled in that way? What steps did you take? And what that does is it kind of like shifts. It doesn't solve everything. The law ain't going to save us. But what it does, I think, is it changes the balance of power. Yeah. And there are countries in the world, as I say, Spain most recently, a couple of places in Australia, New South Wales, Victoria following on, Sweden have it also, and the Women's Equality Party, won't surprise you, is campaigning for that here in Britain.
I mean, and one of the things, when I'm asked this stuff, when I'm speaking to an audience and I'm talking about how men should think about this, I mean, I think that it's unlikely that we're going to have people sort of, I don't know if any of you saw the program last night with Kirsty Wark and others in a house who were sort of a group of women who were, I can't remember, it's called Womenhood. Women. And it was basically looking at all of this stuff that we're talking about. And they were talking about, well, should people have an app on their phone where you can sort of, nobody's going to end up, the whole fun of sex, because sex can be fun when it's consensual, it's mutually respectful, where it's about enjoyable intimacy with somebody you like being with and caring about and all that. But the business about it is that, I mean, I just think you have to be all the time, and our sons and our men folk have to think about this, is you have to be saying, is this okay? Is this okay? Is this okay? It's not complicated. Just saying, is this okay? Making sure that the person's saying, actually, I don't particularly like that, or no. And to be listening to what the other person is saying. We have to teach people about what good sex is like and what respectful and relationships are like, and about how that can be between anybody, whoever the couplings.
So yeah, even if we did have a change in law of that kind, it would have to be accompanied by education and the type of sort of programming and possibly propaganda, that actually helps people understand what consent really looks like, and how I might consent today, that doesn't mean you got a season ticket to my body. We need to change the norms around how we relate to each other in this regard, and that doesn't happen if you just make a change to what's on the statute. It is a much broader and bigger project than that.
Yeah, well, it's about seeing it across the criminal justice system, so better training for the police, more resources, more funding, also for the CPS, and then judges need training as well, and juries need to know that stereotypes and tropes.
It's really hard to get to judges.
It's really hard to get to judges. It's very interesting, the business about trying to train judges, because, and this is the world over, which is that there's this business which is about the status that the judges enjoy, and the idea that they're independent, and therefore they don't want to be taught anything. They think that it somehow is going to undermine their sort of their idea as being the seat of wisdom. And they've got a hell of a lot to learn, and there has to be far better training. There really does. But when we tried to introduce it into the domestic abuse bill
yeah.
in Parliament, it was resisted
No,
at all costs.
I helped to draft that, and the resistance was phenomenal, which to me said more about
It was shocking.
said more about the government, the actual amendment.
Yeah.
You know, we tried to introduce judicial training on rape, domestic abuse, and coercive and controlling behaviour. They were having none of it. They said it'd be unconstitutional, yet they curtailed judicial review laws.
It was interfering with the independence of the judiciary. I mean,
Exactly,
it
yeah.
was just ridiculous. Anyway, I've only got 5 minutes more, and there's a hand there, and there are more hands, so come on.
Amina, you said that you worked on best practice guidelines in Scotland, and I'm just listening to everyone talk about how much there is a process of identification going on between the interrogator or whichever police or legal person is involved with obtaining evidence. And I'm a psychiatrist. I'm sorry you had a very bad experience. I'm very sorry to hear what you said about psychiatry. But I know that in psychiatry, when there is a process of identification, like you're a doctor and you see patients who have a similar age and background to you, you identify, sometimes it can make you less objective because you kind of want to either positively or negatively project evidence of yourself onto that person. And I just wonder how much of our problem is that the people gathering the evidence or prosecuting or whatever have too much in common with the alleged perpetrators, and what can be done about the training of those professionals to overcome the identification?
Yeah, I think it is more complex. I mean, it is obviously a multidisciplinary approach, but I think the thing that's more problematic is confirmation bias, which is that I think that's something that really needs to be addressed. That entering the interview room, even before they've met the victim, with an assumption that there isn't going to be any evidence, or there's a reason why this victim has given consent but is bringing the case forward, and we've heard about, just had one example of that. So I think in terms of selection, I think there is a problem that there isn't enough specialist support, and they always say we don't have enough specialist police officers to work with sexual victims. I think that's just an excuse. I think I don't think it's so much that they identify. I think it's just they have difficulty putting their biases to one side, and they'll say that I'm not biased, but we know these can operate at an unconscious level and affect their decision making. They're still looking for. I have been fortunate enough to work with the Scottish judiciary and the Judicial Studies Committee, where the Justices of Peace, who are often retired professionals, not very representative of society, but goodwill, and they'll say to me, you know, what we're looking for are what can tell us whether somebody's lying or telling the truth. And I'm like, there are no clear indicators, and yet people are looking for that. They're like, this victim doesn't seem to be displaying any emotion, so it doesn't.
They might be traumatized.
That doesn't enter it. So I think, in a way, sometimes it's the opposite. It's not understanding enough about how somebody who's traumatized might come across, rather than empathizing. I think it's more likely to be not having that knowledge to understand, or not being able to transfer control to the victim or the witness, because they're the ones that have the information. This idea that you have to be, as the investigator, have to be in charge and to do all the talking.
I'm just going to, as a Scot, ask you, were you suggesting that you had a better run at things in Scotland?
I definitely had a better run of things in Scotland. I got my foot in the door.
Yeah, very good. Okay, I'm glad to hear it. Anyway, somebody else. You must have. There's another hand there. Yes, please. Yes, that'd be great.
Scotland's talking about that.
Come on, Inez. I haven't had Alex in for a while. Come on.
Yes. But actually, I think rape is already treated as a different crime. So yes, you're saying it's a different crime, but actually it's already treated differently, which is why you see the low rates of conviction, which mustn't be forgotten. I think that one of the ways in which to be radical about it is actually to not treat it as a different crime and to treat it as you would any other violent crime against the person. And that means taking it out of its relationship with stigma and with shame, and we're treating it as something which is like any other violent crime. So you would treat that seriously. You would encounter somebody, a complainant, from a position of a priori belief that they're telling the truth because, you know, it's a violent crime that has happened to them. And then all of the rest of this that we're talking about, the reluctance at every step of the way along the criminal justice system to take cases forward because because the evidence isn't necessarily 100% going to be sufficiently believable, because actually maybe this person's making it up in order to get attention because they're histrionic, because of all these other inventions, if you want, which are put in the way as barriers to convicting people of the crime of rape, including the shame of being labelled a sex offender and a rapist, and juries' reluctance to do that to somebody. So yes, it is already treated differently. It could be treated as something which was more normal. That's not to say that it's like less of a horrific and violating and humiliating crime, but if it was taken out of its relationship with shame and stigma, then it could be that you could have a different transformative outcome in that context.
There is an interesting issue though there, which is that the reason why the standard is high in criminal cases is because of the punishment that follows. And one of the things that the women's movement has done is keeping asking for, you know, the offence to be treated more and more seriously. And therefore, once you start saying that you know that this kind of crime should carry with it a really heavy sentence, and that it's taking a whole big chunk out of somebody's life, and we, men and women both, I hope, give value to the business of freedom and to our liberty. So what do we do about that? About the way in which we punish this behaviour, this crime, and if you are going to punish, and that means jailing and taking someone's liberty from them, which is, you know, a serious thing to do to a human being, you know, in the same way that it's serious to rape somebody. You have to have a way of judging that is setting us a reasonably high bar. So, you know, I mean, in all of this, I've always worried about the women's movement simply responding to serious violation by calling for just jailing people. Because I think that in itself becomes problematic. And so, you know, if you want to have a radical rethink about it, then you'd have to think, well, is it that we think that jailing is the only way of dealing with this, or are there other ways in which you could deal with this kind of offending and this kind of sense of entitlement and the ways in which it's about power, ultimately? So, you know, I mean, I think there is a much more complicated, you know, debate in all of this. And I do think that, you know, simply thinking, well, let's just deal with it as if it were a civil matter with a lower standard of proof. You can jail lots of people that way, but you will have lots of miscarriages of justice too, I think.
I mean, yeah. I see.
That's the risk.
I mean, you mentioned the family courts. Just have a look at what's happening in the family courts. It's even worse in the criminal justice system. There are probably more convictions for rape than there are findings of rape in the family courts, even though it's on the balance of probabilities. There was a case called H&N, which was published in March this year, a Court of Appeal case. I represented 2 of the 4 appellants, amazing mothers, that said that they had been raped. And the way that the family court dealt with that was just, I mean, it was archaic. They said in one case that even though a woman didn't enjoy it, she didn't want to have sex, but she felt it was her duty as a wife. No recognition, of course, of any intersexual inequality she might have been experiencing or suffering with. It was still consensual sex. And they also used her sexual history against her, and the judge said that she was no shrinking violet. That was actually in the judgment, no shrinking violet. So we have a long way to go in the family courts, where, of course,
hands up,
all judgments are private.
Out there, put your hand up.
Yeah, it's shocking. I mean, it was
I think
shocking.
we could have a discussion about restorative justice if we wanted to, but I think that's not.
No, I think
I was going to mention that.
that is another alternative.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but that is another alternative in terms of, because people who rape are also a product of the culture in which such a thing is normalized. So, like, it's putting, and actually, as a criminologist, we tend to think we should not have people in prison if we're on, like, it is something which we are critical of from a disciplinary research perspective. So, actually, other solutions should be explored, including the principle of counselling, restorative justice, and actually the whole. Because I'm saying that basically all of this is underpinned by rape culture, you have to transform culture. We're talking about that. It's small, it's incremental, it's really slow. But actually that also means recognizing that people who rape are not usually waking up that day thinking, oh, this is it, I'm going to be a rapist today. They are a product of the culture and the position from which they themselves are. And so having more recognition of that and how to transform that opens up possibilities for something different to happen.
Mandu.
That's why it does have to be a much wider conversation, because sexual violence is, in my view, one of the ultimate expressions of inequality between men and women. And so we have to have a program of work that actually closes down that inequality and moves us towards a world where women and girls are truly equal citizens to men and boys. And, you know, let's say we even improve, let's say we crank things up and we're convicting the majority. We got 100,000 jail places a year, you know, for all of these rapists. So in a way, I totally get that we have a dysfunction in the criminal justice system, but the bigger project and the thing that is going to make life better for all of us is zooming in on the inequality and making sure that all the ways that manifests is tackled. And then we can actually make progress in ways that we would all want to see over the next decade and generations that follow.
I want to thank you for reminding us. There is a bigger issue out there, and I think it's been one of our mistakes for the women's movement to keep just saying, you know, this is happening to us, you know, let's be more and more punitive and so on, and not getting to the actual root cause, which is the misogyny, the patriarchal society that we live in, and its manifestations in misogynistic conduct. And I really do think that there is a much bigger sort of debate, and the next time we all come together, that's what we have to be talking about. Okay, I'm sorry your hand's up, but I can't bring you in because I'm being given the notice. The time is up. Anyway, I want to thank my panel. Would you join me in thanking my panel? And I want to thank all of you for being a great audience, attentive, interesting, and supportive of people talking about difficult things. Thank you very much. Bye.